Hello, and welcome to another episode of A Time in History. This episode will be titled Plebeian to Emperor, and in this video we will be addressing how the aftermath of Nero's rule affected the Roman Empire, and how under the new Emperor Vespasian, Rome was able to be reunited, bringing about the start of the Golden Era in Rome. With the suicide of the crazed Nero in 68 AD, a power vacuum emerged in Rome, creating the year of the four emperors, by the end of which Rome would be left in utter shambles, and Emperor Vespasian would be left to pick up the pieces and restore Rome to glory. In order to attempt such a feat, he needed to be scrupulous in every action he performed, as he was faced with a Rome that was in tremendous amount of debt and still shaken from those before him. On top of these problems, he was also faced with the fact that he was a plebeian and he was also an emperor. After the suicide of Nero, many of the governors of many countries tried to declare themselves emperor. Galba was the first to try and make Rome his own, then Otho, then Vitellius, and then finally Vespasian. The following minutes will look at how these emperors continued to harm Rome even after the death of Nero. The first emperor to try and lead Rome was Servius Scrupulus Galba Caesar Augustus, also known as Galba. He came to power using the Praetorian Guard prefect Namphenius Sabinus to incite men to trade their loyalty to Galba from Nero. Thus, upon the death of Nero, Galba was proclaimed emperor. Galba, however, made multiple mistakes in his first month of emperor. This can be seen in Plutarch's writing about Galba, as we get a very elaborate and detailed documentation of Galba's ride to Rome. He writes, "Even before his entrance into the city of Rome proper, he was stopped by a party of marine troops who had been given the formal privilege of being organized as a legion by Nero. Demanding official recognition of this fact, the Marines pressed Galba's party. Galba reacted at once, ordering his horsemen to charge upon them. Not long after he was made emperor by the Praetorian Guard, he was killed by them. This was primarily attributed to his refusal to pay them, as they were the ones that gave him power. Galba left Rome with a government full of corrupt and greedy officials whom had been promised an exorbitant amount of money from Galba to install him as emperor, but they received very little of this, thus leading to his assassination. After the death of Galba, and on the same day in fact, the Senate proclaimed the ambitious and greedy Otho as emperor. Otho's fate, however, was the same as Nero's, as Vitellius at the same time had declared himself emperor, sending half of his army to Rome. This army was comprised of the supposable finest legions in the whole empire. When Otho heard this, he tried to split the empire with Vitellius. He, however, had none of it, and Otho committed suicide. If left unchallenged by Vitellius, some believe that Otho would have been a decent emperor, as Suetonius writes fairly fondly of him, saying that when he heard the news that Vitellius declined his proposal to share the emperorship, he gave the privilege of speaking with him to all those that wished to come in. After that, quenching his thirst with a draught cold water, he caught up 2 daggers, and having tied them to a point, put one under his pillow, and then closed the doors. He slept very soundly. When at last he awoke about daylight, he stabbed himself with a single stroke under the left breast, and now concealing the wound, and showing it to those who rushed in at his first groan, he breathed his last breath. He was hastily buried after that. Suetonius' recount of Otho's death is one of the multiple primary sources that we have about Otho, many of which give him praise. This is why a revisionist view of him is one of praise, as multiple primary sources attribute him killing himself as a way to stop a civil war ensuing between him and Vitellius. With Otho dead, the path was now open for Vitellius to become the third emperor. Vitellius' reign, however, like those before him, was short-lived. From the start of his reign, Romans were skeptical of his rule, as he granted himself many prestigious titles. In fact, he named himself Pontifex Maximus on the anniversary of the terrible battle at Allia, where Rome was defeated by the Gauls, which allowed the Gauls a route into the empire. The Roman people's skepticism was further reinforced as Vitellius engaged in a series of feasts and banquets. Suetonius exaggerates, but in his writing refers to Vitellius as having 3 feasts a day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and one at night, whilst also giving himself triumphal parades at every city he went through. Suetonius writes, "For when he began his march, he rode through the middle of cities like a triumphing general, and on the rivers he sailed in the most exquisite craft, wreathed in various kinds of garlands, amid lavish entertainments." These expenses by Vitellius incurred debts quickly, and began bringing the imperial bank to bankruptcy. Vitellius increased his unpopularity by the torture and execution of those who wanted the outstanding debts, and money paid back to them. With financial affairs in a state of calamity, Vitellius took the initiative of killing citizens who named themselves heir, thus inheriting their wealth. Moreover, he engaged in the pursuit of every possible rival, inviting them to the palace with the promise of power only to have them assassinated. Like Galba, Vitellius left Rome in a worse state than he had found it in. He had completely depleted the treasury and had killed off many up-and-coming political figures. Fed up with having Nero-type emperors, the Roman government finally gave their loyalty to a middle-class plebeian, who had shown himself to be both an efficient ruler and an experienced military leader. This man was Titianus Flavius Vespasian, whom would soon prove to be the right choice for the empire, whom thought of the state over himself. Vespasian first made a name for himself when he served as a military leader in Thrace, paving the way for his future role as praetor in Crete and Creon. While praetor, he served under Caligula and Claudius, and he enjoyed patronage of the powerful Narcissus. After his praetorship, he continued his progression under the political hierarchy. This was the first time Rome was introduced to the plebeian Vespasian. From 43 to 47 AD, Vespasian led a legion during the expansion into Britain, where he distinguished himself with military success in the south and southwest of England. Vespasian was particularly noted for his effective use of artillery when assaulting heavily defended positions fortified by earthworks, and was responsible for taking the Isle of Wight. Suetonius was a friend of Vespasian, but he does, however, provide us with the primary source of Vespasian's time in Britain, where he says, "Here he fought 30 battles with the enemy. He reduced to subjugation 2 powerful nations, more than 20 towns, and the island of Victius, near Britain, partly under the leadership of Aulus Plautius, the council governor, and partly under that of Caligula himself. For this he received a triumphal regala." Vespasian had now made a name for himself as a military man, and had gained popularity by being smart about how he played war, and he was recognized for this. His military successes helped him pave the way for his first major political breakthrough, where he was elected consul in 51 AD. This eventually led him to becoming proconsul of Africa in 63 AD. He made many friends in Africa and won much praise due to his administration. This was largely because Vespasian didn't follow suit of previous proconsuls and milk the province for all of its financial gain. At least, that is, if Suetonius is to be believed. As he says, "Then they gave him Africa, which he governed with great justice and high honour. Certain is that he came back none the richer, for his credit was nearly gone, that he mortgaged all his estates to his brother, and had to resort to trading in mules to keep his position." He had now become a populace of Africa, meaning that when a new emperor was to be chosen, he would have the support of Africa. This, however, would not be the last of his popularity, as he would soon become governor of Judea in 67 AD. He was given this role to deal with the Jerusalem rebellion. Here too he won much praise from the people, as well as military success. This meant that he now had the support of Africa and Judea. On top of this, he also had a military acquaintance by the name of Gaius Licinius Maxius, whom was governor of Syria. This meant that now he had the support of the southeast area of the empire. When Vespasian entered Rome in October 70 AD, he was faced with a bankrupt treasury, an empire that was in tatters due to the 4 crazed emperors before him. To add to this, he also faced criticism from patricians and equestrians, whom still saw Vespasian as a middle-class plebeian. Even though his brother had held a consulship in 67 AD, he was still considered a novus homo, new man by many. In order to unite Rome, Vespasian needed to make every decision count, and erase the memory of those before him. In order to obtain these goals, he needed to be able to take criticism, as well as be able to have good judgment. Vespasian did seem to possess these qualities, as both primary and revisionist sources can agree that he did have these. As Guy Erwin Farquhar Chilver, professor of classical studies at the University of Canterbury, England, describes Vespasian as a cultivator, buff, and even coarse manner, characteristics of the humble origins he liked to recall. At the same time, he was astute and ambitious. He built up a powerful party quickly at the outset, and many of his initial appointments were dictated by nepotism or the desire to reward past service. Professor Chiver's description of Vespasian can then be compared to Teutonic's writing, which gives us a surprisingly detailed description of when a Roman senator was complaining about a Roman knight who insulted him. He says, After hearing his complaint, Vespasian replied, "Unseemly language towards the senator should not be used, but to return the insult is kind and proper." We also have Suetonius, who writes, "He did not cease his jokes even when the apprehension of death or extreme danger." Both Suetonius and Suetonius seem to agree that Vespasian was a man of good humour and could see both sides of the story. Whilst Vespasian's good humour is reflected in the revisionist view of him, it is, however, more predominantly focused on his characteristics of ambition and the qualities that surround that, such as his ability to persuade his political opponents into agreeing with him on various political matters. This is different from the primary sources provided to us from Suetonius and Suetonius, who describe Vespasian as almost another Numa. Under the rule of Vespasian, Rome was relatively peaceful. When he first became emperor, many of the Germanic tribes were still loyal to Vitellius and declared themselves free of Rome, saying that they could govern themselves without Roman influence. This independence, however, was short-lived, as no trade of any sort was sent to these Germanic tribes, forcing them to foot riots. This was one of the first acts as emperor that would soon prove Vespasian to be a defied emperor. Vespasian was dealt with the task of repairing a crippled Rome, but in order to do this he would need the support of the rich, of the patricians and the equestrians. To obtain their support, he granted himself all powers that a man could have, and he appointed his son Titus as head of the Praetorian Guard. This allowed for Vespasian to have his son snuff out any rumors that were being spread about the emperor, as the head Praetorian could issue orders without the need of the emperor's approval. This allowed for Vespasian to keep his hands clean. Salure Academy, an academy aimed at improving the marks of multiple skilled children, describes Titus as, "Titus did the dirty work, proceeding over trials and ordering executions of suspected traitors, thus allowing for his father to preserve a reputation of kindness and clean hands. At the same time, Titus acted as a patron to historians, and his generosity towards them meant that they were inclined to write about him and his father in a more positive light. Titus ensured that no propaganda was being used against his father. This tactic meant that many of the rich had to at least appear to agree with Vespasian's political agenda. As if they disagreed with it, many plebeians wonder why these rich praetorians were against the plebeian Vespasian, and as many plebeians, Vespasian included, weren't very well educated, it meant that they based their opinions of people upon the propaganda that they saw. And if they only saw positive propaganda of Vespasian, then they would like him. This meant that if any of the rich outwardly showed they disliked Vespasian, many of the plebeians would just assume that they hated him. This was one of Vespasian's first attempts to reunite Rome. It was, however, not going to be the last. Vespasian needed more than just the support of the rich in order to reunite Rome. He needed the support of the gods, which is why before he left Judea for Rome, he went to an oracle at Mount Carmel. Tacitus and Suetonius both give an account of his time at the oracle. They both agree that what the oracle said was that Vespasian would agree at anything he wanted. They do, however, differ upon what Vespasian was actually told, with Suetonius simply saying that the oracle said he would never be disappointed in what he planned or desired, however lofty his ambitions. This is the more believable version of the two primary sources we have, as Tacitus then goes on to say in his recount, "Whatever you are planning, Vespasian, this is granted to you. You shall have a great mansion, far-flung boundaries, and a host of people at your command." Tacitus then goes on to talk about how Vespasian's victories in the Jewish rebellion make the prophecy at Mount Carmel seem true. This apparent talk followed Vespasian everywhere, and therefore, upon his entering into Rome, he had the support of the god, and was one step closer to being able to reunite Rome and bring about the Golden Era. Even with the approval of the gods and Titus getting rid of the unwanted rumors, Vespasian would not have succeeded in uniting Rome if not for the writers of the time, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Pliny the Elder. Each of these writers owed a debt to Vespasian either personally or they owed a debt to the Flavian family. Their affection has been seen throughout all their primary sources that have been mentioned in this video so far. Tacitus was the Plutarch for Vespasian. He often wrote long stories that centered around some truth but were mainly propaganda about one story to help Vespasian's cause. Their seers were animus that this was a notable sign of future prosperity, and it seemed that the highest honors were promised to Vespasian while he was still a very young man. But at first the omen appeared to be fulfillment in his triumphal awards, the consulship, and the renown of his Jewish victory. Once these were achieved, he was thought fated to be emperor. This is taken from the histories written by Tacitus in 76 AD. Pliny the Elder was also a personal friend of Vespasian, and as such he only wrote about great triumphs that came from Vespasian. Finally, there was Suetonius. Suetonius came from a family that from the dawn of both Vespasian's and Suetonius' families had supported each other. Thus, all of Suetonius' writings are one of praise for Vespasian. Now that Rome had been reunited, Vespasian could focus on the more prominent issues at hand, such as how the Imperial Bank of Rome was at an estimated $4 billion American of debt when Vespasian came to power. To put this into perspective, Australia is currently in $239,425 million American of debt. The United Kingdom is currently in $3.1 billion US dollars of debt. In 10 years, Vespasian would somehow bring the Imperial Bank out of debt and create a surplus, a feat that by today's standards is impressive. In order to accomplish this feat, Rome would undergo significant changes. The basic principle to bringing a country out of debt is to keep everyone working. This is because if people are working, then they are making their own money and paying taxes on it. This is one of the main attributing factors as to why little expansion happened during Vespasian's reign. Because when expanding, he would need to send men, food, weapons, and wine to where he was expanding to. He did, however, still use the profits gained from expansions that did occur. The greatest example of this was when Jerusalem fell in 70 AD. The war booty, that is the men, metals, and weapons obtained from the capture of it, were used to initiate one of the biggest propaganda buildings known today, the Flavius Amphitheatre, or the Colosseum. Thus, the Colosseum was founded mainly from Jerusalem, and was a project that would stand on the lake of Nero's palace, helping eradicate at least part of his image. The building of the Colosseum would also supply a huge amount of jobs for Roman people, and these jobs would last nearly 10 years, which would help stimulate the economy. Using the materials gained at Jerusalem, and using them to build the Flavian Amphitheatre was the first example of how Vespasian intended to restore the imperial bank. Vespasian next used of war booty would come from England. This booty once again was used to build new buildings, the most prominent of which being the Temple of Jupiter, which would inevitably be destroyed. Secondly, he built the Arch Temple of Titus, which upon his death would become the Arch Temple of Vespasian and Titus. While using newly acquired money to eradicate the image of Nero and stimulate the economy was a good step, Vespasian still needed an extensive amount of money. This is why he raised and introduced new taxes, the funniest of which being the tax on public urinals, in which to use one you need to pay a certain amount. A hardly true but funny personal conversation between Vespasian and Titus was recorded by Suetonius, in which Titus was against the imposed urinal tax, and voiced his opinion as such, saying, "Why have you imposed a tax on urination at public urinals?" To which Vespasian replied, "Smell this coin, does it smell to you?" Titus replied, "No." Vespasian then once again replied, "That coin came from P. Money doesn't smell." As with any taxation, many people weren't happy with the new taxes introduced, but Vespasian had proven himself to be a man of virtue, and had the backing of the gods and his riders to support him. On top of this, he ensured that Rome was in a relative time of peace. This was the first time in many years that Rome had actually had peace. On top of this also, Vespasian provided various entertainment factors. Vespasian has now done two things thus far. He has stimulated the economy by using war booty to build A, the Colosseum, and B, many of the smaller buildings such as the Ark of Titus. Whilst these buildings did stimulate the economy, they also had another aspect to them, and that was the fact that these buildings were placed very specifically as to help eradicate the image of the emperors before him. Vespasian had also introduced multiple new taxes to help raise the tax revenue. This, however, was still not enough in order to bring the empire into a surplus. Selling off government assets has always been an option of trying to get it out of debt, and with Vespasian it was no different. After the people of the Italian colonies had given up their land, the remaining land was sold off. The reaction of the Roman people was one of protest, however, as they demanded that either they got more land for free, or the land stayed royal land, meaning that it was part of the empire and could not be sold off. Vespasian, however, contradicted this selling off of royal land, as he forced a redistribution of royal lands of the cities, forcing them to create produce on these lands that could then be taxated. Whilst not technically classed as expansion, Vespasian also took control of some of the free cities that were within the Roman Empire, and forced them to pay tribute. He was strategic about the cities he chose, however, as he ensured that the cities he took over were away from the front line, meaning that they had a little army and had little chance of revolt. On top of taking over these free cities, Vespasian also went to the eastern kingdoms located in Asia Minor, many of whom had a treaty with Rome, allowing them to be independent from Rome but paying them tribute. Vespasian broke the treaty on the bounds that many of the eastern kingdoms were talking with Rome's rival in the east, Parthia. This then allowed Rome to break the treaty and make the eastern kingdom more of a provincial kingdom, forcing them to pay more tribute. This was not the first time Romans had used this strategy, as during the Punic Wars, Rome declared that Carthage had gone to war without the permission of Rome, and therefore sacked Carthage. With the new taxes came new laws. The laws were put in place to try and limit the amount of riots that occurred in Rome, as under Vespasian, viticulture exploded and the availability of food decreased. This is primarily due to the fact that little expansion happened under Vespasian, meaning that there were more people in Rome, meaning that there was more mouths to be fed. This ultimately meant that many people in Rome had a lot of wine in their system but no food. This led to a law being passed so that no new grapevines could be planted. The law, however, fell into massive disarray, as how could you enforce it? Because as Chrysaor says, how could you know whether or not it had just been planted or it's been there for a long time? Chrysaor is a fairly reliable resource as he is an author of the book The Chronicle of the Roman Empires, as well as being professor in ancient history, prehistory, and archaeology. With Rome's financial situation in order, Vespasian also introduced choirs of rhetoric, that is, the art of persuasion in the form of verbal speaking or writing. He also granted privileges to esteemed doctors, teachers, and philosophers in their respected towns. And during Vespasian's reign, a rise in poetry is seen. These are all primary steps that would help ensure Rome reaches its golden era. The relative peace that is portrayed from primary sources during Vespasian's reign is not wholly to be believed, as Vespasian kept 2 legions that were spawned during the Civil War, indicating that there was still some kind of anti-authority group. The only documented attack on Vespasian's life, however, was in his early years. He was easily thwarted and no further attempts were made, however. If primary sources are to be believed, then Vespasian was indeed another Numa, or at least what the Roman people had made Numa out to be. As Suetonius has said, "Yet he made no move, although his followers were quite ready and even urgent, until he was roused to it by the accidental support of men unknown to him and at a distance." Also, he said, he was most generous to all classes requisite to state. This is then shunned by many of the post-revisionist groups such as Professor Chivler, who says that Vespasian was just another Roman that wanted power, that he was very smart about the way he wanted it, but that he was always a man of ambition. Upon Vespasian's death in 79 AD, he had done what many thought would be impossible. He had brought the imperial bank out of a deficit and into a surplus within 10 years. He had constructed the largest amphitheatre that is still standing today, as well as the arch temple of Titus and Vespasian, which can also be seen today. Vespasian was somehow able to keep people happy even after the increased amount of taxation that he imposed upon them. Vespasian had set up a dynasty that would last 30 years. He reunited a disunified Rome and put in place the stepping stones for what would lead to the great Roman Golden Era. Upon his death, Vespasian is said to have uttered the words, "OD, I think I've become a god," to which would later become true as he became deified upon his death. Without Vespasian, many revisionists, post-revisionists, secondary sources, and primary sources all agree that without Vespasian, Rome would have fallen into complete and utter disarray 300 years before it actually did.